the nephew who became the king of pop. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from sharing a face with a legend. For most of his life, that pressure sat quietly in the background for one young man. Then, one afternoon in early 2023, it became the biggest job in Hollywood. Jaafar Jackson is the son of Jermaine Jackson, which makes him Michael Jackson's real nephew. Not a lookalike hired off a casting call, not a distant relative with a passing resemblance. And in April 2026, after years of secrecy, speculation, and an enormous amount of physical preparation, he stepped onto movie screens around the world playing his own uncle in the biographical film simply titled Michael. Before we get into how that happened, ask yourself something. If you had to play a family member who was arguably the most scrutinized entertainer who ever lived, would you want the job? Or would the weight of everyone's expectations be too much to carry? Keep that question in mind because it shaped almost everything Jaafar did in the years leading up to this film. A Long, Quiet Search. The film was directed by Antoine Fuqua, working from a screenplay written by John Logan, and produced by Graham King, the Oscar-winning producer behind The Departed. According to reporting around the production, King and the filmmaking team spent an extended period searching for someone who could believably carry the physical and emotional weight of playing Michael Jackson on screen. This was not a small undertaking. Michael Jackson's movement vocabulary, his voice, his stage presence, all of it was etched into public memory with a level of detail that would make any impersonation instantly recognizable as fake. Jaafar had grown up around that legacy without necessarily being groomed to inherit it directly. His path into music started years before the film was ever announced. He released his debut single, Got Me Singing, in 2019, followed by another single, Confused, in 2020. Before either of those, he had already spent time in front of cameras as part of a reality television project following the extended Jackson family, giving him some early low-stakes experience with being watched and judged publicly, long before a film crew and a global audience were involved. When Fuqua eventually cast him as Michael, it was officially reported around January 2023. For a role this scrutinized, the announcement alone triggered immediate public debate. Could a family member really deliver a performance, or would casting him read as an act of loyalty rather than merit? That debate followed the production for years. Here's a question worth sitting with. What do you think matters more when playing an icon like this? Technical skill built through training or a personal, inherited understanding of who that person actually was? The film's marketing leaned hard into the idea that Jaafar had both, and the training footage that eventually surfaced backs that up. Building the physical language of an icon. Turning any performer into Michael Jackson on screen requires more than styling and makeup. It requires rebuilding how a person walks, spins, holds tension in their shoulders, and releases it into a beat. Reports and interviews around the production describe a demanding, multi-year preparation process, with Jaafar working extensively on vocal coaching and choreography to approximate his uncle's famously distinct movement and delicate vocal delivery. Michael Jackson's choreography wasn't simply hard, it was engineered to look effortless while actually requiring extraordinary control. The moonwalk alone has confused physics teachers for 4 decades. Recreating that illusion convincingly on camera under lights while singing live is a completely different challenge than recreating it once for a viral video. Jaafar has spoken publicly about how demanding the role was, acknowledging the difficulty of stepping into it despite having grown up with music and performance already part of his life. Principal photography on the film wrapped in May 2024, but the project didn't reach theaters until nearly 2 years later. Extensive reshoots and a lengthy editing process pushed the release from an originally planned October 2025 date all the way to April 2026, with reports at the time noting the production had even considered splitting the story into 2 separate films given how much ground it needed to cover. In the end, the studio settled on a single film with a runtime just over 2 hours. Would you have had the patience to keep training and refining a performance for years, without knowing exactly when, or even if, the final product would reach an audience? That is essentially what Jaafar signed up for. A story rooted in family, Not just fame. One detail that separates this film from earlier attempts to dramatize Michael Jackson's life is its direct connection to the family itself. The production moved forward with the cooperation of the Michael Jackson estate, giving the filmmakers and their lead actor access that outside interpretations of Jackson's life have not always had. That access matters because Michael Jackson's public image, built across decades of tabloid coverage, is not necessarily the same as who he was to the people who actually knew him. For Jaafar, playing his uncle wasn't only about mimicking interviews and archival concert footage that millions of fans have already watched. It involved trying to understand a private person behind a persona that the entire world thought it already knew. The screenplay, written by John Logan, was built to trace Jackson's evolution from his childhood in the Jackson 5, through his transformation into a global solo icon, and into the complicated final chapters of his career and life. The finished cast reflects the scope of that story, featuring Coleman Domingo and Nia Long as Jackson's parents, Joe and Catherine Jackson, Miles Teller as attorney John Branca, and newcomer Juliano Cruvaldi portraying a young Michael Jackson in the earlier sections of the film. Here's something to think about while picturing that cast list. A film spanning childhood stardom through adult superstardom essentially requires two different lead performances stitched into one coherent character. Do you think that structure makes a subject like Michael Jackson easier to portray convincingly or harder? From skepticism to anticipation. For a long stretch of the production, public reaction to Jaafar's casting was cautious at best. Skepticism is natural whenever a project centers on someone this iconic. And skepticism around family-connected casting specifically is even more common in Hollywood. That tone shifted noticeably once actual footage began reaching audiences. When the studio released the first official teaser in November, previewing Jaafar recreating some of Michael Jackson's signature choreography and stage presence, the reaction online was immediate and largely enthusiastic. Fans and casual viewers alike pointed to the resemblance, not just in appearance but in movement and energy, as evidence that the casting decision had paid off. By the time the film's full trailer arrived in February 2026, ahead of the April release, the conversation around the project had noticeably changed. What had once been treated as a risky, even questionable casting choice was increasingly discussed as one of the more convincing screen transformations in recent memory. Did you happen to see that first teaser when it came out? If you did, what was your honest first reaction? A lot of people online admitted they went in ready to be unconvinced and came out impressed instead. Premiere and release. Michael held its premiere in Berlin in April 2026, ahead of a staggered international rollout. The film opened in the United Kingdom on April 22nd, distributed there by Universal Pictures, before its wider release in the United States on April 24th, distributed domestically by Lionsgate, with early IMAX and Dolby screenings beginning 2 days before the official opening. The film's reported production budget sat around $155 million, reflecting the scale of recreating Jackson's most famous performances, including sequences drawn from his later career such as the Victory Tour, his acclaimed 1988 London concerts, and elaborate staged recreations of hits like Bad. Early reviews highlighted Jaafar's performance specifically, describing his ability to inhabit Jackson's stage persona convincingly, while also praising Juliano Cruvaldi's portrayal of the character as a child. For a first-time film actor, stepping directly into a lead role of this size, in a production of this scale, is an unusually steep starting point. Most performers spend years building toward a role like this. Jaafar's first credited film role was this one. What would that kind of pressure feel like to you? Walking straight into your very first film role as the central figure in a $155 million biopic about one of the most famous entertainers who ever lived? There's no gentle version of that debut. A complicated inheritance. Michael Jackson's legacy has never existed in a simple, uncomplicated space. He remains one of the most influential and commercially successful entertainers of the 20th century, credited with reshaping music videos, pop choreography, and the modern concept of a global superstar. At the same time, his life was marked by intense, often painful public scrutiny, controversy, and disputes that followed him long after his death in June 2009. Any film taking on his story has to navigate that complexity, and early commentary around Michael suggests the production attempted to trace both the artistic triumphs and the more difficult chapters of his life, including his relationship with his father Joe Jackson, rather than presenting a purely celebratory portrait. For Jaafar, playing a family member under that kind of scrutiny adds another layer entirely. He wasn't just performing a historical figure. He was performing someone he was related to, whose reputation, whose complicated public story, and whose artistic achievements all carried personal weight that an outside actor simply would not feel in the same way. Do you think that personal connection made the role easier because he had access and insight most actors never could, or harder, because he had far more at stake emotionally than a stranger playing the part ever would? It's worth sitting with both possibilities, because the film itself seems to suggest the answer is genuinely both. What comes next? As of the film's release, there has been no confirmed sequel or second installment, despite earlier reports that the studio had considered splitting the story across 2 films during production. Whether that idea resurfaces depends largely on how audiences and critics respond to this first chapter, and how the box office numbers shake out in the months following release. What is clear is that Jaafar Jackson's film career effectively begins here, with one of the most high-profile debuts a new actor could possibly have. Whether this becomes a launching point for a broader acting career, or remains a singular, deeply personal project tied specifically to his family's story, is something only time will answer. Before you go, here's one last thing worth considering. Biopics about musical icons tend to live or die based on one specific question. Does the lead performance make you forget you're watching an actor, even for a moment? Based on everything reported so far about Jaafar's preparation, his access to the Jackson family and estate, and the reaction to the film's early footage, it seems like a lot of people are already answering yes. What do you think made this casting work, if it worked at all for you? Was it the family resemblance, the years of training, or something else entirely? There's a real conversation to be had here about what it takes to convincingly play someone the whole world already thinks they know, and whether blood relation is an advantage, a burden, or both. That question, more than any single dance sequence or vocal take, might be the most interesting part of this entire story.